Our scripture reading is from the New Testament, from the Gospel of Mark, beginning at chapter 8. This is right before a turning point in the gospel. This is the passage leading up to the moment when Jesus will make it clear that his path will take him to the cross. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are moments in the Gospel of Mark that feel so raw and unfinished, you might even say unedited, that they immediately pull you in. Everything happens fast. Jesus and his disciples come to a town, Bethsaida. The locals bring a man to him, and the only thing we know about the man is that he is blind, and his friends want Jesus to touch him. And Jesus does touch him. Jesus takes the man by the hand to lead him out of the village, and we wonder why. Does he want privacy for the man? Does he want privacy for himself as he attempts to heal him? And it is an attempt. First, Jesus puts saliva on the man's eyes, and then he lays his hands on him, and he asks, hopefully, "Can you see anything?" And the man has this wonderful, almost giddy answer. "I see people, but they look like trees walking." I think these words tell us that the blind man was sighted once, because he can interpret what he sees with two visual reference points: people and trees. So Jesus tries again. He lays his hands on the man again. The man then looks intently, and his sight is restored. He can see again. Jesus tells him to go straight home, don't go to the village. Jesus is guarding his identity closely in this gospel, and he doesn't want the man to go blabbing to the community. That's the thing with people you heal. They blab. And that's it. A man who has lost his sight has had it restored after one false start. Now he has perfect sight. And that should be it, a miracle, a sign of God's power working in and through Jesus. Pure and simple. A man who had been walking in the darkness can once again walk in the light. No one has to lead him anywhere ever again. And that would be it if the story weren't located where it's located in Mark's gospel. Immediately after two stories about people who can't see Jesus for who he really is, and immediately before a story about Jesus' disciples refusing to see Jesus' mission for what it should be, that he will be going to the cross. The story about the blind man may well be a true story about a miraculous healing, but its location, in the midst of people doubting and disagreeing with Jesus, can't help reminding us blindness always functions symbolically in the Gospels. It's always used to contrast those who understand with those who don't, with those who are spiritually wise with those who are spiritually foolish, with those who live in the metaphorical light with those who walk in the metaphorical darkness. For people who are actually physically blind, this is a sore spot, I have been told, directly by a blind pastor who I know. For them, blindness is no metaphor. And those of us who have sight often fail to understand how heavily we rely on it until something threatens its smooth functioning. Scientists estimate that 70% of our sensory receptors, total sensory receptors, are located in our eyes. When our eyes are working, they can allow the other senses to kind of sit back and relax. They can shoulder the burden of taking in most necessary information. But have you noticed that we close our eyes to think? We close our eyes to kiss someone. Some of you have told me that you close your eyes so that you can listen to my sermons better, and I believe you. But seeing is not a primarily intimate sense. Seeing allows us to stay at a distance. Astronauts can see Paris from outer space because it really is the city of lights. The other senses insist on greater proximity and therefore greater intimacy. You can't smell the freshly laundered shirt on your little boy from a mile away. You can't even smell it from the next room. You have to be close for that. The same goes for hearing. We can yell and make ourselves heard, especially in an environment with good acoustics like a sanctuary or a canyon. But your beloved generally doesn't want you screaming the things you love about her. She'd rather you whispered those. And for that, you have to be up close. You have to be close to touch, obviously. That's a sense that insists on proximity, along with taste, maybe the most intimate sense. Did you notice that Jesus heals in an intimate way? With saliva, with touch. And that's what the friends of the blind man asked for. They asked for Jesus' touch. To be blind in Jesus' era was a catastrophe. It was to be relegated to being an outsider, an outcast. Even in this country, as recently as the last century, if a person couldn't do certain very specific kinds of work, like caning chairs, or being a really exceptional musician, their best hope was thought to be institutionalization. In fact, blindness still carries a pretty strong stigma with it. It makes seeing people uncomfortable, afraid, fearful we're going to do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, not be helpful in the right way. If we have sight, we tend to assume losing it would be a catastrophe. But blind people tell us otherwise. Those who have surgery to restore their sight often find that the world has become very uncomfortable. It is uncomfortably large. They often prefer to keep their eyes closed when they're at home, especially, so that they can be in that familiar world. This is almost impossible for us to comprehend unless we have had a period in which we were blind ourselves. In 1986, a German journalist named Andreas Heinecke was working for a broadcasting company, and he was assigned to organize training for a colleague who had lost his vision in a car accident. At first, Heinecke felt awkward. He pitied his colleague. But by working closely with this man, he learned that his pity was misplaced. He discovered that being blind is just another way of living, with lots of capabilities. To his surprise, it was the blind colleague who showed him how to cope with fundamental changes in life, forcing him to question what makes a truly valuable life. He became fascinated by the challenges and the abilities of the blind, and he was astonished at the level of discrimination they had to endure. So Heinecke came up with an idea. What if he could create an experience for seeing people that would give them a real sense of the challenges of going without sight? And what if his experience included a role reversal? Those who see becoming blind, and the blind becoming their guides. A traveling exhibit called Dialogue with the Dark was born. And the project was guided by a quotation from German theologian Martin Buber: "The only way to learn is through encounter." So here's a description from their website for Dialogue in the Dark, which is actually in about 25 different cities around the world right now. Here's a description of what you would encounter. As you travel through Dialogue in the Dark, an invisible landscape emerges, composed of sounds, scents, wind, and textures. In tours that can last up to an hour and a half, you explore a park, a city, you embark on a boat ride, and enjoy coffee and appetizers in a cafe, all completely in 100% darkness. The experience allows you to discover how to find orientation and move in the dark, how to identify the world through the remaining senses, how to interact and communicate by relying on other senses, how to generate trust and cope with the unknown. The poet Wendell Berry wrote, "To go in the dark with a light is to know the light. To know the dark, go dark. Go without sight and find that the dark too blooms and sings and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings." Jesus healed the blind man and restored sight to his eyes, and in doing so, he used other senses, touch and hearing, and he connected with the man in a way 20/20 vision can't accomplish on its own. Once we make an effort to understand the experience of those without physical sight, we will learn with Berry that the darkness offers its own mysterious beauty for our consideration. It blooms and sings. Thanks be to God. Amen.